So, thank you everyone for joining us for this episode of Triggered and True, where we're visiting with Laura Duncan, emotional health consultant. And if you've joined any of our past episodes, you know that we've mentioned the word triggered a lot. And we were talking offline that word has become a little bit of maybe a cliched word. People use it a lot in a lot of different contexts. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time today just talking about triggers in the context of emotional health and in the context of what Laura does with her compassion method and helping people through this journey of discovery that we're on. So why don't we start off with Laura? Why don't you give your definition of what a trigger is, and then we'll work from there.
That sounds great. So before I start saying it, I was getting all excited being able to share about triggers, and it was making me kind of laugh because triggers have such a negative connotation to it. It kind of seems funny to be like excited about triggers versus being like, let's get serious about these triggers. I actually felt like kind of this like excitement to talk about it. So I think, and you also see as we talk about it, that triggers do actually become an opportunity versus something to run from. So that's why I'm excited to share it with you today. But yeah, my definition of triggered is a irrational response to a rational or irrational circumstance or event. And what I mean by that is that a lot of times we'll get triggered. And if we recognize that the event that's happening or the person that we're interacting with, it doesn't merit our reaction, meaning I have a lot more of an irrational reaction response inside of me emotionally, but the person's not really doing anything. Then I think, oh, I'm triggered. But if that's the reason why I say it's an irrational reaction to a rational or irrational event or circumstance or person, is because sometimes if somebody, for example, is, being really terrible with us, they're doing things and saying things that we would all agree are really bad. Then if I have a big response to it, it's justified because of what's happening. My reaction merits what's happening. So then we believe that this is okay, that I'm having this strong of a reaction because the thing that happened is a really big thing. But what's even more powerful about this definition of trigger is that you can actually be at peace, not triggered, even if there's a rational, justifiable reason for feeling that big reaction.
One of the other things that, well, I'm gonna say that definition again, just in case anybody missed it. So, as I captured it, the definition is an irrational response to a rational or irrational person, situation, or circumstance.
Yes.
And I think it's very helpful that we emphasize the rational part, because sometimes we overreact to things and we can probably look back and just say, well, that was just completely irrational, that I got that mad that my kids didn't wash the dishes or whatever.
Yeah.
Completely irrational. However, sometimes it's very rational. Like that person cut you off in traffic. Well, that's rational, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Probably not. That's probably another irrational example, but we could think of we could think of someone's, that's irrational. Somebody's
your child's yelling at you saying you're the worst parent in the world, and they're using profanity, and they are having a huge reaction to you telling them they have to go to bed. That would feel like, wow, that child is out of control. I'm upset. It's justified.
Yeah. Well, and even going deeper, I was thinking if somebody stole something from you or somebody hurt you or abused you, it would be, kind of just talk to that a little bit. I mean, that's getting kind of deep, but
it is getting deep because we want to be able to say if somebody hurt me, or somebody abused me, then it's justified for me to have franticness inside of me. It's justified to feel, angry. It's justified to feel these feelings. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't feel those types of feelings. If you went through something that was abusive or painful or hard, you're going to feel those feelings. But the beautiful thing about recognizing how triggers function and how they work and being able to identify that, you can actually be at peace even if you're going through something very difficult. And I kind of joke around and say, like, it's like a superpower, because it's most people are being kind of pulled all different directions based on the justifiable response of what's going on in their worlds. But it's actually so much more empowering to be able to actually be at peace, to not be triggered, to not have a reaction, even when the situation is abusive or painful.
When we were going through this, when I was first learning it, one of the things you shared about very early on, the concept of learning to be okay.
Mm-hmm.
We can learn to be okay even when it's not okay all around
Yeah.
us. And it's not just that we can learn it, it's that you said it more differently. You said it more along the lines of you can be okay,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's not okay all around you. And that gave me a lot of hope because
Yeah.
I recognize a lot of my anxiety was coming from trying to get my external world okay so that my
Mm-hmm.
internal world could be at peace.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
and I recognize from learning more what a trigger is, what was going on
Mm-hmm.
is that I was having a triggered response. And my trigger, a lot of my big reaction was frustration that I couldn't
Yeah.
get the external world to line up.
Uh-huh. Oh, yeah. I mean, we've been frustrated with that story for our whole entire lives, that we can't get our external world to be okay so we can be okay.
Yeah, so that's powerful. And the other thing that helped me again because I had more of the left brain more developed was the logic
Mm-hmm.
component of this. So just talk a
Yeah.
little bit about what's going on inside of your brain when
Yeah, that's good.
when
Yeah.
when a person's triggered.
Yeah, I definitely can relate to that. Even, even though I'm female, I was way more on the logical side. Even when I was first learning that I can be okay, even if somebody else treats me badly or if my circumstances are okay, I was still looking at it logically. And I'd be like, I would do this thing where I'd be like, if someone came up and cussed you out, you wouldn't be okay. And then I would want to bring in what I call the jury. And in the situation when I was first like talking to someone about kind of like wrestling with the whole blaming or not blaming and being able to recognize that I can be okay and not trigger you in this, even in any circumstance, I wanted to bring in a jury. I wanted to bring in the people in the room, bring in people I knew to say, wouldn't you be upset if someone cussed you out? And they would be like, yeah. You go to the next person, wouldn't you be okay? Excuse me, not okay. Wouldn't you be upset if somebody cussed you out? Yeah. So you've got, let's say we have 20 people that we're asking that question to. 18, 19 out of those 20 people is going to say, yeah, if someone cussed me out, it would be justifiable for me to yell at them, to be frustrated, to be hurt by that. And so you get this like justification going on that it's okay to have these feelings because anyone would have those feelings. And so that logical side definitely personally kind of was like this struggle for me because it just felt so real that if this happens, this reaction is okay. And so that was always kind of a wrestle with me. But now it's so much more empowering to know that even if that happens, you can still be okay.
It's a powerful place to live. So
Mm-hmm.
so as exactly what's going on in your brain, one of the things you talked about or you compare this process to an allergic reaction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And an allergic reaction we can kind of relate to because there's something physical happen, whether it's stung by a
Mm-hmm.
mosquito or a bee or whatever. But
Yeah.
just share a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So I'm not allergic to very many things at all, but one thing I'm allergic to is peaches and peach skin. And so I remember, but I didn't have like allergic reactions to it until I was in my 20s and picked a bunch of peaches and was having kind of, a reaction where I was getting like bumps around my face and I was itching and I had all these, allergic reactions happening. And when it happened, because I wasn't aware of it, I was like, what's happening? I didn't go as far as like thinking I was dying or anything like that, but I was definitely like unsettled about like what is happening. I thought maybe it was like the chemicals on the peaches or something. I didn't know what it was because I didn't know what was going on. So it made me feel a little bit panicked, a little bit unsure. There's something wrong with me. And, I need to figure out what's wrong. And so, and then when I was, that went away. And then when I went back to eat a peach again a little while later, same thing happened. And I realized, oh, it's the peach skin. And once I recognized that I was being triggered, which is ultimately having an allergic reaction, once I realized I was having that allergic reaction, I was like, fine. I was okay with it because I knew, okay, just don't touch peach skin and you're going to be okay. But what happens with us with triggers, those emotional allergic reactions they're similar to what I experienced when I didn't know what was going on with me. You feel this, you're breaking out emotionally you're having these big feelings and you're having these big reactions and you're thinking things you don't normally think and you're feeling things you don't normally feel. And you're even physically having reactions that you don't know what's happening. Your chest feels tight, your brain feels tight, you feel foggy. You have all these things going on that you're going, what is happening to me emotionally? And that's why I get excited about sharing a trigger, because if we can understand what's happening, you'll get the same relief I felt when I realized I'm not dying. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm just having an allergic reaction. And once I can identify it, it's not powerful anymore.
Hmm. And specifically, maybe just talk a little bit about what actually is happening in your brain.
On a
What's going on?
neurological level.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was also very empowering to understand, oh, this isn't just me. A lot of people think, I feel like I'm going crazy. I feel like there's something wrong with me. I feel like, what's happening to me, especially if you have a really strong emotional reaction. So, on a neurological level, when a person or circumstance or situation is perceived as a threat, that's what a trigger is. It's perceived as a threat. It feels like a wild animal's chasing you. And so what happens is our amygdala, which is this part of our brain back here, it gets engaged and we go into that fight or flight. And what that does is it shuts down our sophisticated brain, our adult brain, and it ends up shutting that down. And now we're just in this fight or flight primal, or what I call a child brain. And that child brain is now no longer has the sophisticated brain being able to reason. Maybe it's not that big of a deal. Being able to know we have options and resources, being able to know that it's not going to last forever, being able to know these sophisticated thought processes that we have as adults, it's gone. And that's why a lot of times when people, go to schools or classes or read books about, being a healthy individual, when they're in their moment of trigger, they can't access it anymore because it lives here. And that's, again, we've talked about in a past episode about shame. That's where a lot of shame comes in. Because here I am, learning how to be the perfect spouse, the perfect parent, the perfect, if you're religious, perfect Christian, the perfect person. And then all of a sudden, I get triggered. I go into my fight or flight. And now I'm stuck because I don't know how to access that information that seems so tangible 5 minutes ago when I wasn't triggered. And so a lot of times that makes us feel really bad about ourselves because we think we're doing so good because we know so much. But in your moment of trigger, when your amygdala is engaged, you no longer have access to that information. And so we can feel very out of control, very helpless in those moments of trigger.
Absolutely. I I could relate because when we were first when I was first learning this process, I remember after being at a workshop, I came home and I was got into an argument with my daughter in the kitchen about something, I think doing the dishes or something stupid. And at the time she was 18 and I was, 40 something. And it all of a sudden hit me what was happening, that I was out of my adult brain. I was into
Yeah.
my child brain, primal brain, like you're talking about,
Hmm.
and no longer in the kitchen was it a 43-year-old and an 18. It was now two
Yeah.
5-year-olds arguing.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
it just hit me. And I was like, oh my gosh, this has been too much of a pattern of my life. But
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah.
So the other
And
thing,
really, on a neurological level, you are, because your brain has gone into that 5-year-old. And that's why our arguments and how we're handling those situations does feel like we're a 5-year-old.
yeah, I was actually sharing with this information one time with a gentleman that was on a county board.
Hmm.
And after I shared it with him, he said, that was the last county board meeting. And I couldn't figure out why all these people were acting like such children. They were just so, I'm like, well, now you know.
Hmm.
Now you
Yep.
know what was
Now you
happening.
know. Exactly.
Well, and the other thing is about a trigger, we don't want to position them like there's something bad, because they're
Hmm.
not bad at all.
No.
Even when they're happening when they shouldn't be, they're not bad.
Hmm.
But before we even get into when they happen when they maybe shouldn't be, this was part of our design. We
Yeah.
want to trigger at certain times.
Hmm.
If our house is on fire, we want to trigger and not
Yeah.
think. We want to act primal. We want to act about survival and
Yeah.
grab what we need to grab and get the heck out. We don't want to stop
Hmm.
and think. So I think when I think you first described it to me, you talked about, a trigger is basically your brain telling you that a wild animal is chasing you.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lion
Yeah,
chasing you. And that's a wonderful thing if there's really a lion chasing you.
exactly.
But when there's not a lion chasing you, that's where the problem comes in.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah. That's very true. And so, yeah, it definitely becomes because all that adrenaline that's being released into your system when a trigger happens makes you on high alert, which is a form of anxiety. And what a lot of people deal with because they're constantly on high alert because on an emotional level, pain, the predator, is always chasing them. And part of why we don't like triggers is because we're adverse to pain. We are resisting feeling pain because it hurts. But the very reason that we're triggering in the first place is because we're in pain. And so that's why people are pushing away triggers so strongly, is because they're actually terrified of the pain that lies underneath it.
yeah. Well, and the title of our podcast is Triggered and True. So we're really
Mhm.
getting down to the core here. We've hinted at and talked a little bit about true self. And I think that I'm hoping people are starting to see that a lot of their life, they're not living from their true self. They're living from this triggered, they're stuck in this
Mhm.
emotional allergic reaction.
Oh, yeah. Like when when I would meet one on one with people and I'm describing what I'm describing here right now, people are like, wow. Like when I talk about you're having physical reactions, you're having mental reactions, you're having emotional reactions. And we kind of explore that. We go back through it. Many people are like, I think I'm living triggered. And sometimes people don't realize it because it's not like sometimes we think if we're living triggered, we're just yelling at people all the time. But triggered is fight, flight, freeze. And so what ends up happening is we might be in flight. We might not be yelling at anyone, but all of our emotional allergic reactions, all of our mental, physical, and emotional symptoms are telling us that we are living in a constant state of flight.
Yeah, that's really good because for me, I tend to think of it more as fight because when I
Hmm.
trigger, I tend to get really mad or loud, and that's
Hmm.
kind of
Yeah.
what was modeled for me as my brain was being developed as a child, and that's what I tend to do. But I also can get very quiet and just withdraw,
Hmm.
and
Yep.
I never realized that was me being
Hmm.
triggered before, but I do that
Yeah.
quite frequently. So just speak to that, the different way people trigger.
Like you said, where how you what was modeled to you or how you reacted habitually or historically was more fight. I do think we are all prone to respond more fight or flight because of just personality, environment, different reasons. But I believe that we all trigger both ways, even if we are more, prominently, triggering one way or another. And one thing that people again don't realize is that flight is just as impactful, painful as fight. Even if it doesn't make as big of a mess, when you go into flight, you leave your marriage, you leave parenthood, you leave friendship because you're in flight. And it may not be as overtly bad behavior, but it's going to actually have just as much of an impact on yourself and on others. And a lot of people don't see it as bad, especially if you're raised in an environment that being self-controlled, being quiet, a lot of people can pride themselves in not having a reaction. They yelled at me and I just sat there quietly and I took it. That sounds really good. Like you didn't lash out, you didn't have a reaction, you're being a really good person. But we don't, again, realize that that's actually hurting us and others just as much as yelling at people and going into fight.
Absolutely. So you talked a little bit about it. You mentioned it where the trigger is coming from.
Hmm.
It's coming from pain.
Yeah.
So again, triggers aren't all bad. We know they're good when a lion's chasing us. That's a great
Hmm.
time to trigger. But even when the lion's not chasing us and we're triggering, talk about
Yeah.
why they're not necessarily bad then. What can they do to help us?
I'll talk a little bit about emotions to connect it. So we're talking about your emotional reactions. And so a lot of times emotions get a bad rap because they feel like they're deceiving us. They feel like they're out of control, that they're exaggerated, that we're going to make bad decisions because we're in an emotional state. So when we get triggered, we're going to have big reactions. And when those big reactions are happening, we want to be able to recognize that it's ultimately our heart, our mind saying, help, help. And we don't listen because we're adverse to pain, or we don't understand what they are or what to do with them. A lot of times it's ignorance. We don't even know that we're suppressing them. Repression is when you subconsciously suppress your pain. Suppression is when you consciously suppress your pain. So sometimes we don't even know we're repressing our pain until it gets really loud. And our heart is literally yelling, help. And so we get really big reactions and really big emotions. But then we get back into that shame cycle, and now we're just bad because I acted that way and I behaved that way and I had those big reactions. Instead of actually inviting those big reactions into our environment, to start asking them, what's going on? What are you trying to tell me? I would never have these big reactions or have this negative behavior if I didn't have pain or if I didn't have unmet need. And so the two reasons we always trigger, we always have reactions that are counter to who we truly are, is because we have pain that hasn't been comforted or needs that haven't been met. And so if you think about it, it's like having if I had a wound on my shoulder and this was my pain or this was my unmet need, and you came and you pressed on it, I'm going to have a big reaction because I have an open wound on my shoulder. And it's not you poking on it that's causing the problem. It's the wound that's causing the problem. Because if that wound was healed and you came and did the same poking on my shoulder, it wouldn't hurt because there's no wound. And so what triggers is a reaction to our wound, to our pain, to our unmet need.
Yeah, that's really good, because I think if people can learn to recognize that, they'll be able to step out of shame and see that, okay, this isn't the real me right now. This is the triggered me. But as we've talked about before, what we do does matter. If you made a mess and you have to clean up the mess, you're going to need to go clean up the mess. This is not an excuse to get out of cleaning up the mess. But what it is an invitation to go a little deeper and see, okay, why did I do that?
Yep. So a lot of people, like you're saying, what you do does matter. If you were standing in front of me, and you know how when you go to the doctors, they have that hammer and you hit your knee and it kicks your leg, and it's a reaction. I'm not kicking my leg, that hammer does it, and I just involuntarily kick. So if you were here and you were standing in front of me and I had that reaction, I kicked you, and you were standing there, I would kick you. So what I did was I kicked you. But because it was a reaction, it wasn't coming from me wanting to hurt you. It was just a reaction. Of course, I'm going to say, I'm sorry that I kicked you. But I know that it's not my identity. That's not who I am. Who I am would never kick you if I didn't already have a wound that was causing me to react and hurt you. And it's really important to know, because we walk around thinking, I am, a terrible person. I'm hurting people because I get angry. I'm hurting people because of this or whatever is going on. But ultimately, we are not hurting people. We would never hurt people, because who do we hurt the most? The people we love the most, because they're the closest to our pain.
Yeah, that's why they say it's always hardest at home.
Yeah, you can go out and be a hero in your community and a hero to all those that aren't close to your pain. And then you go home to your spouse and your kids, and all of a sudden you're in a fight or flight, acting completely contrary to who you are.
I think this gives what Jesus said that was the greatest command, was to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. Because as we do this, we recognize that the best thing we can do for our loved ones is to learn how to comfort that pain.
Yeah.
So we're doing this for ourselves first, but as a side benefit, the people around us will have huge benefit to that. Yeah.
Yeah. Because if you just become, a lot of people say, well, I just need to become self-controlled. I just need to manage my triggers so that I can behave well in my environment. But at the end of the day, that's actually not loving well.
And
It's
it's
all I'm
exhausting.
doing. And it's exhausting and you cannot maintain it long term. You will always trigger. One of the things I always say is one of the things I like about triggers is they never lie. So we can, in our logical brain, say, I'm doing great. Everything's good. But then I go home and I get triggered, and that's telling me something's going on in my heart that I can't suppress or repress, that I have to take care of because the trigger is letting me know it's there. So that's why triggers are such an opportunity, because if you didn't get triggered, you would never go to your pain. It's like I've said before, we're adverse to pain. So we'll do everything we possibly can to deny it and avoid it until our emotional allergic reaction gets so big that we have to take care of it.
Yeah, that's true. That's really good. I actually had in my notes written down from one of the workshops that you've done in the past. I wrote, triggers don't lie, but logic does. We convince ourselves we are okay when we are not. This convincing takes a lot of energy.
A lot of energy.
And right below that, I wrote down that logic does have a role and emotions
Mm-hmm.
have a role. They are
Yeah.
both equal in this. One's not better than the other.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as people go through this, they can start to kind of come up with maybe a theory that, one of them's bad and one of them's good. Well,
Mm-hmm.
they both have a very important role here, because
Yeah.
ultimately we want that logic, and part of comforting the trigger is so we can access all these things we've learned,
Mm-hmm.
so we can
Yeah.
access our adult sophisticated brain.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Exactly.
so now that we have a better understanding of what a trigger is and what's behind it, why it happens, it
Yeah.
doesn't happen because there's something fundamentally wrong with us. It happens
No.
because we're hurting.
Mm-hmm.
And in another way to look at it is we get out of character when we're hurting.
Mm-hmm.
We're not being our true self. We're living
Mm-hmm.
from that triggered self. And yes, you don't have to be flying off the handle 24/7 to be your triggered self. You could just
Mm-hmm.
be quiet or anxious,
Mm-hmm.
anxious or depressed, or a
Yeah.
lot of these things. And that's just our body's response to pain and unmet needs. So how do we approach, we know that pain needs to be comforted. How do we approach that? What's kind of the first step that we would want to do
Mm-hmm.
to learn how to do that?
So if I'm in an emotional place where I'm in that fight or flight, and my amygdala, that part of my brain, is engaged, my sophisticated brain is not working, I'm not going to be able to get out of it by figuring it out. I'm not going to be able to get out of it by changing my behavior, by doing the right thing, by getting better. In fact, what happens when we're in that fight or flight, and we try to tell ourselves what to do, and we try to be self controlled, it gets worse. Because it's like a child saying, I have pain. And we say, shh, you don't have pain. We're just going to be self controlled right now. And what would happen if you told a child, just be self controlled, and they're bleeding? They're going to get louder because they need help and they need you to take care of their pain. And so when we try to be self controlled, it actually gets worse. We try to be better behaved. You see it all the time. A spouse or a parent realizes that they're flying off the handle. So they go to anger management class, or they go to try to get, more self controlled. But what happens? It gets worse because it keeps getting pushed back down. And so being able to recognize that we can't fix it by trying to do better, now what are we left with? And the only way to get your amygdala to calm down is through compassion. Compassion is the antidote for shame, and compassion is the thing that helps our amygdala calm down. And so it's literally like thinking of compassion almost like an ointment, and being able to put that on that part of your brain for it to calm down. And when it calms down, when it realizes a wild animal's not chasing you anymore, it realizes that there's nothing wrong with you. It realizes that we don't have to get better, but we need compassion. We need love. We need to have someone be with us in that feeling of a wild animal chasing us.
And you shared this before. I've got a lot of notes written about what you've shared about compassion, but one of the things that I guess compassion was hard for me to get my head around because I still saw it as weak.
Mm-hmm.
So I needed to find a little logic, because
Mm-hmm.
compassion was weakness in
Yeah.
my mindset. But when you shared that about Jesus, how he was moved with compassion
Mm-hmm.
and he healed. So
Yeah.
that the compassion was actually, you stated, the force that he healed with.
Mm-hmm.
And what I wrote down is compassion is the force and healing is the byproduct.
Yeah.
So if you want to
So
elaborate a little
compassion
bit,
is,
yeah.
yes. So the compassion is the force that calms, soothes, helps this part of our brain come calm down. And so that's the force behind it. And then as a byproduct, my sophisticated adult brain comes back on. And we underestimate compassion. And one of the biggest things is kind of how you were saying, like, oh, compassion kind of feels weak. Well, people misunderstand and think that compassion is pity or sympathy. They were just feeling sorry for ourselves, which we know that's a ugly road to go down, because if you have pity for yourself and you feel sorry for yourself, it's actually agreeing with the belief there's something wrong with me. It says there's something wrong with you. You're less than. You're not enough. Poor you. You're a victim to your world. You're not strong enough. You're not big enough. You're not able to get through this. That's what pity says. But compassion is being able to see who a person is in the midst of their pain. Compassion doesn't see pain as the identity or the problem of why our amygdala, why our brain is freaking out. Compassion sees who we are and comes in to be with us and to actually connect with how powerful we really are for us, to be able to be there for ourselves, how powerful we are in those situations, even if our emotional allergic reaction feels like it's saying contrary. So compassion says, I see you and I'm with you as you feel wild animals chasing you. It doesn't say, you're poor you, there's something wrong with you, I'll help you because I feel sorry for you.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think this mindset of compassion as weakness obviously is a huge block,
Mm-hmm.
to preventing people from feeling healing. And I think that another thing that can block the accessing compassion is people, it's easy sometimes to justify our triggers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's another way, I suppose, another form of blame. And
Yeah.
it just yet another way that we don't just be real.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways that I've heard a lot of people justify their triggers when they're rational is they'll use examples of, like Jesus when he flipped the tables in the temple, and
Mm-hmm.
it's like even Jesus he had a, and I'm like, well, I don't think Jesus ever had a temper tantrum. And what most of us do are temper tantrums.
Mm-hmm.
And so just talk a little bit about, just maybe just a little bit about that, and how maybe people use different things to justify that, maybe
Mm-hmm.
how that blocks the flow.
Yeah. So going back to the definition of it being a irrational trigger, a irrational response to a rational or irrational situation, and being able to justify it. If you think about it, it's always keeping us in our trigger when we justify external circumstances, making it okay for us to act that way. And anger is not a problem whatsoever. Anger is actually something we need to feel. Anger is a doorway to walk through so that we can connect with what's going on inside of us. Anger, for example, one thing I say about anger is ungrieved sadness. It's scared that we didn't get comfort in. It's lonely that we didn't have anyone be with us in. And so I feel this sadness I don't know how to let out, and the sadness gets pressed down, it comes out as anger. And when we have a justifiable reason, we feel like it's okay that we got angry because we're standing for justice, because we're coming against the different things. And so it feels very justified. But one thing I've noticed a lot of times when people are trying to help other people, it's because they didn't get what they needed. So their form of justice is not actually for the person, that has, something happening to them that's not, it's not justice. The injustice we usually feel is trying to give to other people or protect other people the way we weren't protected.
Hmm.
And when I see true justice happening, I see it's coming from a place of being okay. And my definition of being okay is clear minded, tender hearted, at peace. And when I'm able to be in that place and I bring justice, even if I'm very direct and passionate about how this behavior is completely wrong and we need to do something to bring justice to it, I'm coming from a place of being okay. And if you think about it, when we're trying to when we have that anger that we feel like is justified because other people have bad behavior, and so we need to be angry and upset about it to prove how bad that behavior is, that means that we're not actually connecting with who the person is in the situation. And, it's very common to be able to be on the side of, my anger is justified because this person's bad, or is my anger justified because these behaviors are bad? So
Hmm.
when I get angry and I want to bring justice, I'm doing it because of behavior to change behavior, not because of who the person is.
Hmm.
Because true justice will come from seeing who the person is that's causing the pain, as well as seeing who the person is that's receiving the pain or receiving abuse or whatever's happening.
And that's really good because that's what tap opens the doorway for compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And you gave an illustration from a movie in one of your workshops from a movie called Moana,
Mm-hmm.
and that resonated with me because obviously I have four daughters, so I've definitely seen that movie.
Yeah.
But I know that maybe some people have heard of it less. But one of the other examples I thought of from a movie and from a children's book was the story of the Grinch.
Mm-hmm.
And the Grinch was totally living from his triggered self. He had the pain in childhood. He's totally living from his triggered self.
Yeah.
And he wasn't able to connect to his true self until he had an encounter with compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that story unfolded, Cindy Lou was the first agent of compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And she was so sweet because it was coming from a little girl. A little girl was able to see beyond the
Mm-hmm.
Grinch's triggered self and be able to see him for who he really was, his true
Mm-hmm.
self. And so she was able to look at him not through sympathy, because kind of what you were describing before sounded to me a little bit, people trying to get justice for themselves a little bit by helping others, was still a little bit of, I feel sorry for these people.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So you're still kind of putting yourself in this upper level, them in a lower level. There's something wrong with
Yeah.
them. I'm going to try to help their pathetic situation. However, living a life where you don't see people as victims, you see them as hurting,
Mm-hmm.
but not as victims, is very empowering, because it helps really tap into a higher level. It really helps you tap into compassion, because
Yeah.
compassion, those other things are absolutely not compassion, like what you
Mhm.
described with the sympathy and those other things. But where I'm trying to go with this, and kind of to finish today off, is to finish this episode off, is to help people practice compassion for themselves.
Mhm.
And I like the story of using Cindy Lou and the Grinch, because the compassion came through a little girl. And I was not able to tap into compassion for myself until I started to see, oh, in my trigger, I'm really little. One of the
Yeah.
things you say over and over again, the bigger the trigger, the bigger your response, the littler
Mhm.
you are.
Yeah.
So when I started to kind of tap into that and see myself as little in that big triggered moment, and even connect to the younger version of me by
Mhm.
looking at pictures and things like that, that was really
Yeah.
powerful. So just talk a little bit about how someone could, when we learn to recognize our triggers, kind of trace that down, and how you could tap into compassion.
So as a practice to connect with compassion, because specifically self-compassion, myself personally, I have natural compassion for other people. But when I turn that same force, that same compassion that I have for others, towards myself, it was very awkward, very uncomfortable. And how I would talk to myself in a compassionate moment was very robotic. I'd be like, "You're gonna be okay. It's all right. And it just felt so methodical and robotic because I was not connected to self compassion. And one of the practices that I did to kind of open that up to be able to start giving myself compassion is to picture somebody that I loved, picture that compassion that I give to others and be able to feel it and experience it. So you'd want to think of like a real time that you saw somebody hurting, that you didn't feel pity for them, but you were moved with compassion for them. You want to be with them in their pain and take that same feeling and instead of extending it towards someone else, being able to take it and put it on your own heart. And because compassion actually has substance behind it, it's not just saying nice words to someone, it's the feeling behind it to be with them. And so if you have a trouble being able to show yourself compassion, being able to connect with people that you have experienced giving compassion to, and then give that to yourself.
Well, Laura, that was a great introduction to compassion. And I feel as though we've definitely covered a lot of ground today. And obviously, compassion is so central to this whole process because the method is called the compassion method.
Yeah.
And really everything we're talking about is compassion, just learning to recognize that your triggered self, and when you have a big outburst or whether you find yourself in that triggered moment, just learning to recognize that trigger and recognizing that that's not the real you,
Hmm.
that's compassionate. I mean,
Yeah.
that's huge.
Yeah. It definitely is.
And we want to go a lot deeper into compassion because it is the ultimate healing force
Hmm.
here. We're going to go much more into that in another episode, but today we gave a great introduction. So
Yeah.
anything you want to expand on there, Laura, as we wrap things up for today?
I just agree with you. The fact that you're even recognizing what a trigger is, you're exploring this and starting to understand it and wanting to really get to know yourself better, both in, your identity, but also in how you trigger is really valuable. And like you're saying, that does open up for compassion because that first step of even wanting to understand what's behind what we've perceived as what's wrong with us for potentially most of our lives, that is a very compassionate act. And then now we can move on to in the next episode, really being able to go into a greater depth of what compassion is and how to apply it and how for it to become second nature in our lives.
Yeah, and more in depth on what compassion is and isn't.
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
a lot of what we think is compassion, as we've hinted at a little bit today, isn't really compassion. So,
Hmm.
yeah. All right. Well, thanks a lot, Laura, and we look forward to our next time together. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.